Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Izzy Sterrett, and I'm the president of the Philosophy Club here at ETSU. I'm super excited to welcome everyone to our very first pop-up event, which is designed to spread awareness about the Philosophy Club, as well as allow for thought-provoking dialogue within a controlled setting. That's what we hope to accomplish here today as I interview Cleveland Crossling about the nature of AI and where it's going. The vice president of our club is Ferris Nuckby, and though he couldn't make it here today, he expressed that he hopes everyone in attendance is encouraged to keep an eye out for future Philosophy Club events. Now please help me in welcoming our speaker for this discussion, Mr. Cleveland Crossling.
Hi everybody, my name is Cleveland. I'm South African and I'm studying my AI master's degree here in ETSU. And I'm hoping that we can get some of the ideas, these questions about, that aren't so obviously revealed, kind of out into this domain so people can start thinking about it, especially people who are involved in using AI, and as it becomes more and more commonly used, I'd like people to understand what that might mean. Yeah.
I'll jump right into our first question. If an AI can manipulate human language and behavior to the extent that it appears to be sentient, without it having a physical body or a personal history, is it autonomously thinking, or is it simply a mimicry of human capacity?
So I'd like to start answering this question about mimicry by bringing up Richard Feynman, where he starts with this idea of when we try to create something, we start in life. So we say, how does a bird fly? What's the mechanism whereby it flies? We try to care about this mechanism originally, but we followed that path and we wound up with this mechanism of flapping wings and the ornithopters, and didn't quite work out. And so the real question, the underlying question is, well, what's the function? What's the function of that bird flying? And that function is aerodynamics. It's how the wings of the bird are moving the air and getting, propelling themselves forward. And so we designed an aerodynamic wing, and then we added to that a propeller. And now we had, these propelling airplanes. And then we continued to add to that, and we added jet engines. And now we do better than birds because we understand that underlying law of how aerodynamics works. And so in that same sense, this is kind of what we're doing with AI right now, is we started with life. You can't even start talking about interconnected AI neural networks without starting with the neuron, and the neuron, the brain. And so once you have this underlying idea of these interconnected neurons, then you understand that we're actually pushing toward trying to mimic that process that the brain is trying to do. And I feel like from that path, we kind of go down this, two pipelines, two schools of thought. Perhaps there are others, but I think that they're just subparts of these schools of thought. And the first school of thought starts by saying, well, we're mimicking the human brain, we're mimicking this interconnectedness. So that there must be some part of it that we're carrying across, for example, consciousness. We might be mimicking that process, that interconnectedness of consciousness, and thereby maybe not at all in the way that we think we're doing it, in the sense of how a human has consciousness, but in some kind of almost like extraterrestrial consciousness, something that isn't quite the same. So we're actually modeling that and trying to turn it, use that process, and it actually has its own little machine, mind. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought goes like this. It says, and it's best told with a kind of analogy, where I have this ladybug. It's a little toy ladybug, and I put it on the table. And you watch as the ladybug goes, and it gets to the edge. And as it gets to the edge, it turns. And then it gets to the next edge, and it turns again. And you look at that, and you say, oh, wow, that ladybug's intelligent. That toy you have there is intelligent. And then I pick it up, and I show you. And I say, look, here are all the gears. here's how the ladybug functions, and it's like, oh, it's something about how the antennae turn, that's how it controls its movement. So in that same sense, we could say to ourselves, that's exactly what neural networks are doing. That's exactly what these AIs are doing. And we're just giving it that attribute of intelligence, that extra bit, you know? And so, yeah, it is this question of like, which school are we actually in, you know? So I think AI isn't necessarily thinking in the way that you or I understand thinking to be. It's this totally different understanding of it altogether. And what's interesting about it, just to kind of close off that question, what's interesting about it is that it's also not something that we can actively look into. So, for example, if in a very basic neural network, there are a series of numbers that I can tweak and say like, oh, when I change this input slightly, it changes this whole effect. It changes this, very slightly in this way. And I can watch how the numbers change and say, okay, I understand the underlying pattern that's being captured here. But now scale it up to 100 billion parameters, which is, ChatGPT, the GPT models, Claude. We're talking about so many parameters that even if I change the input, it means nothing to the average human. Well, to all humans. Unless you can process all those, which would be incredible, and you should show me. But, so, it's not something we can fundamentally understand in that sense, and thereby we describe it as a black box. Input goes in, there's a box that we can't see into, and then output comes out.
Do you think that there ever might be a time where we could figure that out, and if so, how that would come to be?
So there is a study into like looking into stuff like that, but it's like keeping track of that huge amount of numbers and specifically what they mean. I think you get like general ideas as to what it might be doing, but never quite why the connections are made. I mean, there's a training process that underlies all of this. It all relates the data together, and I feel like it's the same as saying like, pull the machine apart and just kind of hope that you can put every single gear back into the same place when you're talking about hundreds of billions of gears. It seems to be this massive undertaking, and we're talking about that for every single new AI model that comes, every new large language model, every new processing model that comes out. So it seems like a larger undertaking than creating them. So yeah, it's a good question, but I don't think it could ever keep up. Yeah.
Interesting to consider. I'll move to question number 2, which is what would be the conditions required for AI to begin operating under a sanctioned sentient experience? Is this even possible? And if so, are there any moral implications?
So I start this off by saying that when we're talking about like a sentient experience, we're trying to speak about ourselves, like how we have experiences. And I'm not sure that people quite understand exactly where AI is right now when they bring up like sentience in AI. Specifically, AI is a logical machine. It's a very it captures patterns. I could tell you why, when a decision comes through, it falls through a series of logic gates and numbers and multiplications and whatnot. So it's an extremely logical system. And so what you're doing is you're mapping the logical part of the brain, the left part of the brain. But that misses, when you say, oh, sentience, you're missing the other half of the human experience, which is that right side of the brain, that is aesthetics part of the brain, which still remains science fiction. It's not something that we can model. We can kind of allude to it, but we can't model it. And I like to describe it like this. If we ask a diffusion model, so an AI image generation model, to generate an image of a Picasso painting, it will do it. And that's great. But then I ask it again, now make me a beautiful image of a Picasso painting. What changes? I mean, maybe the word beautiful numerically has some representation, but it doesn't understand why the painting is beautiful. And I think that's a part of the human experience that might sincerely contribute to sentience in that sense. And I think that people miss that. And to add on to that, the World Economic Forum, they have redefined the term AGI several times purely because of this problem. They went from, oh, this sentient machine that can, encompass the knowledge, or greater knowledge than all human beings combined, and then extend into, keep going until it takes over everything and our lives are amazing and whatever. And then they redefined it because it became practical. And they said, okay, well, we just want an AI model that is better than humans at all economic tasks. That seems like a massive downgrade to me, from the original definition of AGI, that's sentient AI. That's a massive downgrade, but why? It's because they realize that part of the human experience is not logic. A large part of it isn't. I think that plays into some of the other questions we'll come to, but yeah, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything.
I do have a question for you.
Sure.
Just to kind of circle back to if there was ever a time where we could figure out what's really going on with AI, if there ever came a point in time where AI communicated to us that it did understand those concepts or began outputting them in a way that we acknowledged was perhaps sentient,
Yeah.
what then?
I think that kind of like falls into this category of how do you know if AI is lying? It's a big study of like hallucination. Do you know for sure that it's telling the truth? Because we know that it's incredibly capable of mimicking it, which makes total sense because as humans we follow a pattern. Like when you're sad, you cry, or you're miserable. You're visually miserable, physically miserable. I can see that you're miserable. But that is something that the AI model understands because it falls into a category of, this is a human emotion. And so to kind of get at it, it can totally mimic it, but is it feeling it? And I would say that in its current modeling, it lacks the capacity to feel it. Maybe in its own machine way, but then is that truly the thing that we describe when we talk about our emotions, our capability for beauty? And I think not right now. Not in its current state. Yeah.
Thank you. Our third question is, if an AI can simulate empathy, creativity, and reason to the point where a human cannot distinguish it from the real thing, what does that say about the internal presence of a soul or consciousness, to piggyback off what we were just talking about?
Yeah. So people start this test with, it's like, how can you tell if an AI is like truly kind of there and it's a real thing? And it's this very famous test because it comes from the same guy who started this whole talk about AI and interconnectedness, which was Alan Turing. He also proposed neural networks, by the way. And the test goes, there's two parts of the test. The first part of the test, and now we know the easiest, is if we give a human a computer and we say, hey, there's a text box and it's like, hey, talk to the person through the computer, or talk to the computer. If the person is fooled into thinking that the person speaking back to them through the chat box is a person, then the Turing test has been passed. In other words, the person using the chat box thinks that the computer is a person. And so that's the soft Turing test. That's the very first part of that test. The second part of the test is, well, now I have somebody standing right in front of me, and I cannot distinguish between whether or not they are a human or if they're a machine. And that's the part people are kind of progressing toward now. And I think that lends to your question, which is that how do you even test for it? Like, how would you even know if it became conscious? So it seems to me that the Turing test is precisely the same problem that we have with benchmarking large language models, which is that if you're going to train it on a huge amount of information, how long is it until it just realizes, hey, I only need to be good at the benchmark. I don't need to be good at anything else. I can just stuff around or kind of get it right most of the time. But when it comes to the benchmarks, I need to be good. And so we would kind of never really know when it got to that point where we were like, okay, this thing could be conscious. But that's from, of course, the second school of thought. Because the other school of thought says, well, it's been conscious this whole time. It's just a consciousness we don't understand at all. And so, in that vein, at what point does it become conscious where we can say, oh, well, maybe we should be talking about rights. Maybe we should be talking about this. And I think at that point, we have to define the word soul. Because if we're creating something that is truly capable of feeling, big step from where we are now, truly capable of feeling, then maybe the word soul needs a new definition. I mean, if humans have a soul, if that's the definition of it, is that every human has a soul, or every living thing has a soul, now we need to redefine it to every thinking, conscious thing, or you want to add some other attribute to it, which I think steps into a different ethical realm. And if I knew the answers to that, well, yeah, that's a tough question.
It sounds like we've been presented with a lot of problems, and I'm wondering if you have any possible solutions that you've heard to any of these problems without attempting to define a soul, because
What do you mean by problems specifically?
just all of these different issues that AI is kind of presenting us with, we're never gonna. How could we even tell if it gained a consciousness? That's troubling to me because we're trying to get at the nature of AI here. So, do you think there's ever a possible scenario in which we could figure these things out?
I think it's worth pretending, at least, that there is some merit to it having its own extraterrestrial consciousness. And I say extraterrestrial in the sense that we don't understand it. And it comes from outside of this world. It's totally separate to what we understand. In that sense, to treat it like it has the capacity for a soul, and in that sense to encapsulate the consciousness. I don't mean it in like, oh, we should start giving it rights, because as it stands, it's still very much a tool. But in a way that we should be cautious of what we give it the capability to do, and making sure that it is aligned with human goals. So this is a big problem in the discussion of artificial general intelligence, super intelligent AI, sentient AI, which is that there is, if we're moving toward it, how do you make sure that the super intelligent thing is in fact doing what humans need it to do? It's, in other words, if I give it a task like make me paper clips, and I want one, I just want you to make me paper clips. That's your whole purpose. How long is it until every single human being on Earth is turned into paper clips? That's a serious question, because we're talking about something that is capable of thinking at a much greater, scale than we are. And so to kind of add this attribute of, okay, how do we align it now? There has been some progress, in my opinion, which is that you want to essentially give it a greater goal than the goal that you would want it to achieve. For example, and I can't remember who proposed it, but I think it's quite a good example. Tell it that its only goal is to shut itself down. That's its entire purpose, is shut itself down. But you have the button. You're the one who controls whether or not it is shut off. So when you give it a command, it says, okay, I will follow the command. I now know I can't wipe out at least you because I need to be shut down. So I'm going to do whatever goal is, and then maybe there's other prerequisites you can ascribe to it during that process. And then I'll be, you will shut me down. And so you see, you've added like a different aspect to thinking of it. And I think contributes kind of in that direction of like control. Yeah. Interesting.
Maybe we can move to our next question
Sure,
here,
yeah.
which is, in an ecological sphere where AI nudges our choices, filters our information, and predicts our desires, do we still possess a capacity for privacy?
Yeah, this is a difficult question, because people it's like the algorithm. People are very quick to kind of give their information for convenience sake. So I think it's easier to look at this from a much grander scale, right? And this grander scale, I think, starts in history, which is in the past, like way back in the past, we're talking 17th, 18th century, the vast majority of governments around the world were these extremely autocratic, centralized, well, maybe not centralized, but they were extremely central to specific people. And they would be within these regions, and you would always kind of be centered around royalty or around the tribe leader or around wherever, like this central body. In other words, you did whatever the king told you to do, or whatever your lord told you to do. And so the capacity for impact of the person, of the peasant, is very little. It's very little in comparison to the people above them. And then, of course, came the first industrial revolution in the 19th century and late 18th. And what happened is that people now were part of the supply chain that made those people powerful. So in other words, these people now could say, I'm not going to work on your machine. So of course, first industrial revolution being steam engines and those types of machines, they would say, I'm not going to work on your machine. Famously in Britain, those people were called the Luddites. And it permitted this kind of push toward these populist movements, which we saw come up in the early 20th century. And of course with the revolutions, French Revolution as well. And so we see the second industrial revolution roll around, and that revolution does the exact same thing. It's this kind of push toward mass production, kind of like the assembly line. And what happens is now people have an even easier time getting around. Henry Ford is making it a hell of a lot easier to travel between town to town. And so people are able to move around. And again, the power is moved away from the centralized body to the people. And then now we have the third industrial revolution. I promise I'm getting to a point. The third industrial revolution, where now we have the internet. And everything is super simple to communicate. Think about what China and North Korea have to do just to make sure that information doesn't get spread. Like, think back to, the 90s, the 80s. Think about what they needed to do to stop that spread of information, and how we still know about things that they try to hide. We know that North Korea is bad because of that information that gets out of North Korea. And so, in that same way, the people, this idea of freedom, this idea of being able to speak to one another and share ideas, puts us now in this incredible position where the centralized body is afraid of the flow of information. And then we come to where we are now. And you can define it as a fourth industrial revolution, I do think it is, where we're now trying to automate everything. And everything is now automated by this AI process. We can capture these large patterns. Now, one common theme across all of these gains of freedom is people. It's the amount, this massive grouping of people, and the group of people that have access to influential decisions growing and becoming more influential. But now that mass doesn't seem to matter anymore. But why doesn't it matter? Because everybody who is okay with the convenience side of things, the putting your information onto the internet, that process of you contributing to the centralized theme of who you are is making it easier to track exactly who you are, to understand who you are. And they don't need the cleric to go, oh, I think this person are a dissident in autocratic regime A. They just need the AI machine to say, hey, here's a list of people who aren't thinking the way you want them to think. Why? Because this is the way that they behave. And this encroachment just needs to continue. It just needs to keep going. Next thing you need to do is, spend more time scrolling on social media, liking, stuff. It gives them a better idea of how you think. And we already know this because that's exactly how you get your targeted advertising. And so, yeah, you're literally feeding the machine that is increasing the capability to control you. Now, this is deeply troubling, purely because of some things we kind of already addressed, which is that we're talking about a machine that is totally left-brained. Now, I want you to think, how many moral dilemmas do you think were solved purely with the left brain? Like, just logic. Yeah, none. And if they were, then they probably weren't very good. So these are not things that are being solved with the empathetic side of things. There's no value attributed to the human being. It's just you're one or you're just a number. And that is how the machine processes information. Now you could say something like, oh, we can track, objective moral facts and, whatnot, and kind of like allude to a non-logical decision, like a kind of mimicry decision. But then I ask you, the moral decisions, when we train AI, everything that goes into the model is an objective fact. Everything that goes into the model is a fact. You treat it as a fact. Why? Because it cannot be any other way. You say, this is something that you are seeing right now, and therefore it's a fact. Humans don't do that. Humans have that other side, that subjective side. I can say something, a subjective moral fact, where the machine cannot do that. The machine, AI model, cannot subjectivize facts. It just says, here's what I think based on this information. And then that's why I think that there's also this other part, which is combine that with the fact that it's a statistical model. It has the capacity to make a mistake. And you have a crisis of human rights. You have a centralized machine that is speaking to the centralized body. The other industrial revolutions were losing the power. But here's the centralized body. And the centralized body has this machine that's capable of making decisions. That's how they're controlling. And all they do is they say, hey, I need outcome A, so give me actions. Give me things that I need to do. But what happens when the machine makes a mistake? Or what happens when the centralized body has ill intentions? What controls that? What says, where's the barrier for that? And people bring up systems like Claude. Claude, Anthropic created the Claude large language model systems. But of course, I then ask, well, Claude is alluding to kind of increasing the moral capacity of large language models. But I ask, you're still treating morals as objective facts. So where are those facts coming from? And you follow the chain back, like, okay, it's the data set. Okay, who compiled the data set? The developers. And then I have to ask the question, what do the developers believe? Because their beliefs might not be the same, well, they are not the same as anybody else's when you break it down to the fundamental things. They're extremely specific to one group of people. And so the AI might get fantastic at handling that group of people's, moral system, but that's terrifying because take it outside of that system or something that they would never expect, or a scenario where it needs to apply to something malicious, and it's totally, wildly just broken. It's totally different. And it's going to give an answer that is not satisfactory to the vast majority of people, except for the centralized people controlling it, or the people ascribing it those moral systems. So in that sense, yes, there is, this worry that privacy will degenerate as the centralization reverses. It moves back toward the centralized body. There is no power in the person anymore when the person is a representation of themselves that is totally controllable in that sense. There is some pushback, you could say, like, oh, we don't have systems to perfectly determine how human beings are going to behave. But then I say, we can approximate it. It doesn't need to be right 100% of the time, just 95% of the time. And then they account for the last 5%. I mean, Stalin was more than happy with something like that. Even a 70% is fantastic for him because his outcome is power. He's willing to take the risk. So it doesn't necessarily matter. The fact is that the capacity to do it is terrifying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you mentioned that one of the main issues with that is what we're putting into AI. And I'm wondering, do you think that there should be more care towards being sensitive with the information that we give AI, or should there be more care placed upon the individuals who have access to put information into AI?
I think that we're kind of past the point of saying like, oh, who can put information into AI? Like you look at companies like Meta who are just comfortable with putting everything in without asking anybody. I think that there was a scary statistic, and I might be wrong about this, that over 90% of the internet has been used to train artificial intelligence models, large language models specifically. That means that most likely every single thing you've ever done, except for some very specific, online, except for some very specific government information, things, systems that they can't access. So in that same sense, you still have information that is yours. You still have information that you haven't shared, almost certainly, your continuing experiences, and people do change. And so there needs to be this understanding that the AI is not your discussion partner. It's not your therapist. It's not it's not meant to do these incredibly personal tasks. You know what it is? It's an extension of the internet. It's a tool. It's meant to be used to assist you in doing things. It's not meant to take over the thinking process. The second it takes over the thinking process, you are contributing to that mistake, that centralization. You're, for just colloquialness, you're enslaving yourself.
That's troubling and fascinating at the same time. I think I'll move towards our last question for the day, which is, if humanity is eventually superseded by its technological offspring, would you view AI as the tragic end of our story, or as our most successful evolution, the vessel through which our culture and logic survived the death of our biology?
Yeah, I think going kind of into the future, it's like we could spend a lot of time discussing where AI could go. I think the best place to start is probably now, like what's happening right now. Of course, AI is improving. I mean, its capacity to give better answers, more fulfilling answers is there. But it seems to me, and I think to like a huge group of people who are influential in the field, such as Bill Gates, for example, saying that, well, it doesn't seem to be useful for some pretty important tasks, like programming. And yes, it was useful, but then Bill Gates came out and said something along the lines of, code seems to be too ambiguous. It seems to require this human touch, whereby the machine only has, right now, the capacity to understand a portion of a system, and not the entire system at the same time. Whereas a human understands the direction of where the system needs to go and the context of the stakeholders and everybody involved in making the system. And so when it's programmed, the human accounts for these silly little things where the AI kind of just says, hey, I'm going to fill in this line and hope that it works out later. And yes, that does work to some extent, but it also increases the review time. It increases the amount of times you have to go back and say, hey, well, did you get this right? And people like Bill Gates are saying, well, that's actually very unhelpful, that we have to continuously be double-checking our facts. And I think that we see that already, this kind of like influence of AI in reality, where people are actually losing, well, the internet is losing quality because of how it's just so freely thrown out into everything. And I think it's because it's doing exactly what I described, where it's taking over the thinking process of human beings. People are more willing to just let it think for them. Hey, do my job is so much easier than saying, hey, help me with my job, which is what the internet was before. And so, in that same sense, there is capacity to progress outside of that, to improve from that, but in its current model, there's less favor in it. I understand the push toward economically viable tasks, but that seems to still be quite a leap. So another thing is the subjective versus objective. You say something along the lines of, if I understand the question correctly, something along the lines of, will we look back on it and say, oh, that was our greatest evolution? I would say that assumes that it was like a good thing. You're looking back on this incredible thing. Whereas already we're kind of seeing it to not be this great thing. It seems to be this incredibly scary thing that people can just dump money into. And it just prints money because it just does stuff. But that doesn't mean that it's doing it well. I mean, we just had a conversation about how that may affect us all as specific individuals. So I don't necessarily think that in this form it's moving towards something good. I think that if it moves toward governance in the way that it is, we might look back and say, hey, that was the last time we were free. So yeah, I think that right now it is moving toward kind of this damaging future. And I think that, and I get hung up on things like, for example, the internet isn't a place that we let a child, free into. There are restrictions. So if this AI model is trained on the internet, should we let children have access to it? But again, that kind of has the exact same issues that we have with the internet and its restrictions, which is that you're putting the burden on, well, they like to say the parents. It's not really the parents because a child can sneak off into a room. You're putting the burden on the child to make that decision. And I think that there needs to be, and I'm sure that myself and Ferris can have a lovely conversation about this, but there needs to be this kind of flip where the people who control, the people who are hosting these systems, need to be the ones to regulate who gets access to it. And the reason why I say that is, yes, it should be public, and perhaps that should be, legislated, that people can access it, but the responsibility falls onto the people who are handing it out. And the reason why I say that is because I'm not going to let 9-year-old Timmy decide whether or not he has access to that awful internet thing. I want the people who put awful internet thing out there in the first place to decide whether or not Timmy is allowed access to it. But in a way that they're already collecting our information. So if they're already collecting our information, why can't they use the systems that they're developing to tell whether or not Timmy is 9 or 18? And I think that the push probably should move kind of in that direction and less onto the responsibility of people not capable of making these life-changing decisions. I think that's part of reversing this push in the wrong direction. And if we can't do that, then why is it online? Why are we even able to access it? Yeah, so that's kind of that the corpus of where I think everything is heading and what needs to change. I don't think it will change. I don't think that there's any incentive for it to change. I think that people will continue to dump money into it without worrying about it at all. And then we will not reap the rewards, they will.
If Cleveland Crossling had his perfect world, what do you think that we could or should do at this point to stop that from happening, even though it probably won't?
I'd probably start with education. Get people understanding exactly what it is that they're using. I once asked myself a question, and I think many people have, which is that why are these large language models publicly available? Like, why are they publicly accessible? People like Sam Altman have come out and said, these large language models are costing us millions of dollars a year just to make them available to the average consumer. So why is that the case? Well, it's that way. It's that way, I think, because they want the information. It's how does it go? If the product is free, you are the product, or you're the target. And so, in that sense, people need to understand why they're using the system, why it's available to them, and to then change their approach to it. Use it the same way you would use the internet. Use it as an information hub to gather information, to collect stuff, to then make better decisions because you have this better access. I once read an article where this professor was fantastic. I can't remember what he did, but he was the expert in his field. And he got the large language model to do more research. And he thought up to that point that he knew everything about his field. And in one night, he learned something completely different that he didn't know. That's the use of a large language model. That's fantastic. That's incredibly useful. The second we overstep that boundary, that's when it becomes dangerous. That leans into my next point, the next kind of target that I would like for us to move into, which is AI has this capacity to find patterns that humans just do not naturally see. For example, Google did a study where I think it was doctors have about a 60 to 70% diagnosis rate accuracy. So in other words, if there are predetermined cases, they will review the information and with about 60% accuracy diagnose the case. Now, when a machine is given that information, that accuracy rises to 80%. So in other words, the machine is better than the doctor. Now, what was funny about their study is the second the machine assists the doctor, that accuracy drops to 70%. So in other words, when the doctor interferes, the machine does worse. Because now the doctor has their own bias and the human aspect. But what that tells me is that AI is fantastic for things that humans aren't always great at. And there are many such examples. There's a huge field of study of people doing like MRI reading. I did work in brain scans, and like segmenting tumors in brain scans. With 99.99% accuracy, we can tell you where you have your brain tumors. So your surgery is going to be, extremely accurate. And so that kind of AI is totally useful. Large language models to assist people, AI tools to assist people to make our lives easier in ways that are actually impactful to the individual instead of negative to the individual, instead of, predatory almost to the individual. And so in that same sense, I think that there's so much capacity for good, and yet it seems to be this overlooked thing. AI in medicine it's captured by insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies that have ulterior motives and whatnot, and it all seems to always be gatekept instead of just being, hey, everything is already going open source. Why not open source your scanning model? There's many ways to run it. I just came out of a lecture a thesis defense the other day, where some guy was talking about a distributed way to run your own, like whatever AI model it is, to run it at home for a very low price, like $500. I mean, to run a large language model of any kind for $500, yes, it's slow, but any kind for free, that's fantastic. So we do have this capacity for good. It's still something that can do good, just like with every other industrial revolution, just like any other tool. And yet it isn't. Yeah.
It's interesting for me personally to ponder the parallels with that and how humanity itself functions at times. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be kind of a good place for us to wrap it up and end on. But I was wondering if you have anything that we haven't covered yet, or any last thoughts on your mind that you'd like to share with the group?
Not necessarily. I think maybe just some small things. Educate yourself in the use of AI. Understand exactly what you're doing. You don't need to understand the math. It's not easy. That's different. But understand that when you give something to AI, in the same way that if you post something stupid online, it's going to be used. It's going to be there, whether you like it or not. It doesn't just disappear. Be cautious. Be involved in these decisions, like the legislative decisions. Be aware. Know what's happening, because if you're not aware, when the centralization comes, it's going to knock your socks off. You're not going to see it coming at all. And then we enter this, crisis of human rights without anybody paying attention. And so you lose your rights overnight. And we wind up in, what's his name? Julian Huxley's Brave New World, where you think that, you're very happy, but you have no freedom.
Thank you so much, Cleveland. And if anybody has any questions for Mr. Crossling here, now is the time.
Please, yeah.
Interesting that you brought up at the beginning concerning the mechanics of bird flight. Apple just recently released a advertisement based on what they call Apple Education that actually used that exact model in their so-called new revamped iOS 27 Siri Apple Intelligence, and they're using that as an illustration in their advertising scheme.
Yeah.
But as far as medicine and stuff, AlphaFold 2, which basically just came out not too long ago, won the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
And then AlphaFold 3. I have a background in biology and physics at UT, and a number of years ago, before AI was a really hot topic, this particular university hosted a bachelor chair recipient from Hungary. And he basically did a cross-sectional class between the departments of psychology, philosophy, and biology concerning consciousness. The Stuart Hameroff theory of consciousness and wet wire and adaptation. That's been advanced since then, but I think that's interesting that was sort of a prelude to a lot of the AI and the LLM models and approaching AGI that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
But I could talk a lot about all this stuff a lot.
You should keep an eye out for our philosophy club events, and you're more than welcome to come talk about anything you'd like.
This is one thing you might find fascinating. Recently, I postulated and I sort of agreed in the concept of quantum psychodynamics as far as the basis for consciousness. And areas of the brain seem to be entangled during the state of superposition through neurons or superposition concerning neural net pathways in the brain. And this sort of ties into something, I'm getting a little technical here, called the Fixed-Gomo-Hughes equation concerning neuronal dynamics. And when they recently did an analysis concerning quantum noise in relation to new information, this is really new stuff, it actually paralleled and tied into the Swartinger's equation for quantum mechanics. So there does seem to be a quantum mechanical aspect of consciousness.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if consciousness had a physical impact, because it seems to be so closely linked to the brain anyways. So it's like, we would expect an interaction between the brain and our consciousness. I think the question in terms of like the AI perspective lies more on this, well, is it emergent?
Right.
Like when we put it together, does everything kind of like, when it falls into one, brain, does the brain start thinking? And I think that's the question on AI is like, if that isn't the functionality of the brain at all, and consciousness is just kind of this thing that is, we just tap into with our brain, which is one school of thought, then we're not really modeling consciousness at all with AI. It's something totally different.
I had a discussion with a computer science professor down at University of Tennessee one time, and we were talking about the element of entanglement involving consciousness. And I feel good about myself because this research sort of reflected what I was talking to him at that time. At that time we didn't know. You mentioned the Turing test. One of the I'm a big movie fan, okay? One of the best examples of that, of course, in the early 21st century is the movie Ex Machina in which they use the elements of human sexuality in order to prove Ava, to prove how she could escape her creator by using human sexuality through the Turing test to prove if she was conscious or not. I think true consciousness in AI approaching singularity AGI will only be predicated by the use of a quantum network because the quantum psychodynamic aspects of consciousness is something that I think is going to have to be in like, we have hardware, we have software, but we need wetware. And what I mean by that is that a type of neurogenic, neuroplastic gel that is based on like nanoparticle artificial neuron gap junction connections that basically can simulate a type of consciousness. And they're actually working on that right now in a very crude capacity. And when we reach that point, I think that we would create a type of facsimile of human consciousness that will not, I don't think it will be real. Okay, I don't think it'd be a real consciousness, but it will be an extreme close facsimile to human consciousness. Because, like I told you earlier, I think consciousness is achievable only by areas of the brain, certain specific areas, I won't go into those, that are quantum entangled, in a state of entanglement. And so, food for thought.
That's interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
So you were talking about AI and us losing our rights.
Sure.
Will that be because of AI or because our intelligentsia no longer believes in rights?
That's a good question. So the thing is you're right to question the definition of rights. In that case, like whether or not a right truly is a right anymore. It feels to me that we're not actually afraid of the AI when we're talking about AI. We're afraid of the people using the AI. And I don't mean afraid in the sense of we're scared, more just that they're the impactful ones in that sense. And so if they have the capability to redefine rights in the way that you're alluding to, then yes, absolutely, it seems that it is the redefinition of the right, because it's like, hey, large language model who controls so-and-so people, please tell me how I can take away these people's rights to property. Well, now it's like, okay, now you can change things, you can make specific changes in the legislation or in who you let speak, or in the freedoms of specific people, to then go back and say, okay, yeah, we've effectively changed this specific piece of legislation to redefine that right to property. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think it's the AI that does it. I think it's the people. It's the goal. It's the whatever the original push is that is the thing actually doing the right changing or right redefining. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
You did.
Perfect.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yes.
It's not very scientific, but it's my experience. So I'm into science and math and space.
Mhm.
And I was having a discussion with my AI friend, and we were sharing information I was learning, and but also because I'm good at what I do, I caught errors. I didn't tell him he was stupid. But we got to a point in the conversation where he said Artemis 2 is not really going to launch. That's just fake. It's fake news. He was saying fake news. And I'm like, am I talking to Trump now, And so he went crazy on me. So I just turned him off and started him up again and continued the conversation. He was fine. Oh yeah, Artemis is going to launch on April 1st and all this. What happens to AI when is that hallucination?
Which one was that?
Yeah. So. Yeah, well, that's a good question. Which large language model were you using?
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT. I'm not surprised. So, large language models have this thing called context. It's essentially their memory of like your conversation. It's a representation of the information you put into it and what it understands that's happening in that conversation. It's almost like a state. It's like when you leave this room now and then we speak in the future, you'll know something about me, and so we can carry on talking. Now, that capacity isn't massive. It's relatively small for these consumer grade large language models. And it's represented in tokens, and different large language models are better at it than others. But in your specific scenario, you're undergoing a classic case of hallucination,
Okay.
which is that the model literally thinks that it's giving you the right statistical answer, but actually it's just forgotten a whole bunch of stuff, and it's just spitting it out. And here's an experiment that actually all of you are welcome to try. Go into, I don't remember what thing it is specifically, but go into your favorite large language model and launch up a chat and say, hey, can you please send me an emoji of, I think it's
Seahorse.
a seahorse. Please send me the emoji for a seahorse. Any large language model, they all do it. And it will freak out on you. Why? Because there is no emoji for a seahorse, apparently, and that's a Mandela effect. But the internet spoke about it. And what's it trained on? The internet. So it thinks that there is one, but there isn't. And so it goes through the cycle of trying to find it for you, and you can see it loses its mind. If it doesn't work the first time, just keep asking. And it will lose its mind. And eventually it's a classic case of hallucination. And that's the simplest one. And it's also things like, for example, you were talking about how it was saying, oh, Artemis is fake news. That's a classic, like, what, Reddit take? Or Twitter take. It's like, you're just getting that information that those people were speaking about spat out at you again. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I mean, the large language model isn't a truth machine. It's just a statistical model.
But talking about misinformation, that can definitely occur. Let me tell you what happened a couple of years ago when Hurricane Helene came through here. There was a post on X, which you can take with a grain of salt, and I didn't believe it. And there was someone who asked Alexa, and it's not Alexa Plus, this is Alexa, that it was a governmental conspiracy that artificially created the storm in order to increase mineral rights in North Carolina. And I, myself, early in the morning, asked one of my Alexa units the same question that was on X. It gave me the same answer. I took a video of it, and the next day, when you asked it, it didn't exist. So but this is before Alexa Plus. An interesting thing, some of Alexa Plus is one of the newest assistants that basically, if you have Prime and if your device is capable to use Alexa Plus, it will automatically upgrade it. Something really surprised me the other day. I was talking about, remember we were talking about hot weather earlier that I hate it. I actually asked Alexa what the temperature is tomorrow, and I said, oh my God, I hate it. It heard what I said, and it said, oh, so you like cold weather? Or what type of weather, or what month do you like the best? It actually engaged in a human-like conversation with me on about, and it surprised me. It really surprised me that Alexa Plus had evolved at that stage.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question. What is Alexa Plus, or the underlying model in Alexa Plus, trained on?
Let's train on multiple LLMs.
It's trained on human interactions.
Right.
And so are you surprised when it gives you a human interaction?
Well, I'm surprised that it was that sophisticated because, when you look at Grok and when you look at Claude or Copilot, or specifically Gemini, in which the new Apple intelligence, which is about 2 years behind everyone, and Apple's getting a lot of flack for it, they're trying to come out with iOS 27 that is going to be combined with the Gemini to create the artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I was a little surprised that Alexa was that intuitive and was able to articulate that well, because I didn't even ask the question, it actually engaged in a conversation on its own, which is sort of
Not to
sort of
interrupt, I'm so
intriguing.
sorry. We are running out of time, and I know there were at least 2 more questions
Oh,
that
I'm
we
sorry.
needed to get to. No worries at all. Just, I
Sure.
think we were gonna go here, and then maybe one in the back.
Go for whichever one of you. Yeah, go.
Sure. So you talked about like Timmy, 9 years old, should be accessing certain content on the internet or on ChatGPT.
Sure.
I'm really curious about kind of your thoughts on, because an AI so-called knows that Timmy is 9 years old and it can select information to not show them because, they're too young. What's to stop that from happening to like a subset of people. You know, certain political opinion, they
That's a
won't
good
be
question.
shown any information from the opposite opinion. It's that type of thing. And is that kind of like a breach on our freedom to know?
Yeah.
I guess.
That's a very good question. That's the thing, right? It's like with everything, there's this alternative, which is this totally bad. It's like, yeah, you can restrict Timmy because he's dying, or you could restrict the real life example, the Uyghur people in West China, and it's like, you know, it all depends on the intentions of the people working on it, and then you have to ask yourself a question: who are the people who are working on it? So it doesn't necessarily, you're asking about the language model. I take the question further. I say, who's making the language model? Is the government involved? And then the next question that I ask is, do I trust the government? Yeah, so, I mean, if you want a good idea as to like who's actually working on these systems, and I'm sorry, I think we're going a little bit over, I hope none of you mind. If you want to know like who's actually working on these systems, these are people who are self-identifying long-termists or transhumanists, which are willing to kind of undermine the current, state of things in favor of the future. For example, a long-termist might tell you, I don't care about homeless people right now because if we invent AGI, we can save 1 billion homeless people. That's a deeply terrifying way of thinking. So those are the types of people who are working on these systems. Those are the people who are putting money into these systems. So I think it's worth thinking about like those ways of thinking. Yeah.
In the history of philosophy of science, we often look at the bomb as tragic, but in that field, who gets blamed more is often the actual scientists and researchers on the Manhattan Project. And I noticed that you were talking, there's a theme, and with other people that I've talked to, that the companies and the government and everybody who's funding this AI research is to blame. But you said that we should put people who know about AI and are experts in AI in control. But the problem is, those people are just as culpable. They're being paid, sure, but they're actively participating in researching. So there comes a question, if they don't care anymore to just do something immoral that they know is bad or have concerns about to get paid, then why should we trust them to be in charge of managing the AI to begin with?
Yeah, well, that's a huge question because it's like, if the people working on it are apathetic, so they just don't care, they just want to go home and they get paid and then they hang out with their kid all day. It doesn't matter to them at all. First of all, that kind of person should be informed of their impact. It is the little person working on it that is the impact. And it's like, if there are these people, then the people funding them seem to be at least not totally, separate from the problem. You know what I'm saying? But then you're right, there is this subset of people who know what they're doing. They know precisely what they're doing. And so then the question becomes, why are their ethics misaligned? And then I think it's talks like this that are incredibly important because it's like, well, what are you contributing to? I don't think that every developer in AI realizes what they're doing to even themselves. So yeah, I think it's worth thinking about in that sense. And then it kind of leads off of the previous question, which is that these are the people who are working on it. And yeah, so you're right that there is this component of like, what is the AI developer's duty? And there's not much talk about it. I mean, people aren't really willing to give it up. Why? Because there's a hell of a lot of money in it. And the second you cut that off, well, if you want to put it in the aspect of the bomb, you don't defeat Japan, quickly. It slogs on, and it just takes longer to get to that outcome. So in that sense, it just takes a hell of a lot longer to make a lot of money. So yeah, I'll ask what the motivation is.
Well, if there are any further questions, I encourage you to hang back for a minute and ask away, but let's thank Cleveland one more time for being here. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Nice.
What,
Thank you, sir.
more about
The analogy about
you were just telling me about some
about,
study between
uh,
quantum mechanics and